The morning of July 28, 1944, over the shimmering coast of Saram Island, felt like a slow-motion execution for the pilots of the 475th Fighter Group. Flying at 12,000 feet, Colonel Charles MacDonald scanned the horizon, his nerves frayed by a persistent, gnawing reality. The fuel gauges of his P-38 Lightnings were ticking toward the point of no return. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Dutch East Indies, a single gallon of gasoline was often the difference between a hero's welcome and a watery grave in the Philippine Sea. Flying off his wing was a 42-year-old civilian in an unmarked flight suit, Charles Lindbergh. Officially, the world-famous aviator was there as an observer to study engine performance, but beneath his calm exterior lay a radical secret. At precisely 0947 hours, the relative silence of the formation was shattered by a frantic radio burst. 7 Japanese aircraft were emerging from the cloud deck, led by a Mitsubishi K-51 Sonya bomber. Standard 5th Air Force doctrine dictated a tactical retreat. The Lightnings were at the absolute limit of their combat radius, and any aggressive maneuvering would surely drain their remaining fuel, leaving them to ditch in enemy-controlled waters. But instead of turning back, Lindbergh did the unthinkable. He banked his twin-engine fighter into a screaming dive, his throttles shoved forward into a regime that every Allison engineer had labeled as mechanical suicide. As the P-38s plummeted toward the jungle canopy, the Japanese pilots of the 6th Sentai prepared for an easy slaughter. They knew the twin-tailed devil was a heavy, fuel-hungry beast that struggled for agility at sea level, especially after a long-distance transit. Captain Saburo Shimada, piloting the Sonya, watched the silver glint of Lindbergh's fighter closing the distance with impossible velocity. The American aircraft wasn't wallowing or conserving energy, it was accelerating with a ferocity that defied the laws of aeronautical physics. In a head-on pass that lasted a heartbeat, Lindbergh's 4 50-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon tore through the Sonya's fuselage, sending the bomber spinning into the emerald depths of the forest below. It was a flawless kill. But as the formation reformed, the real shockwave hit the American pilots' radios. When MacDonald checked the squadron's status, expecting a chorus of emergency fuel declarations, he was met with silence. Lindbergh, who had just engaged in high-intensity combat after a 600-mile flight, signaled his fuel reserves. The twist wasn't just that he had survived, it was that he had more fuel remaining than the pilots who had stayed in formation. By violating every technical manual in the Air Force, the civilian observer had just proven that the world's most advanced engine was being flown completely wrong, and the impossible reserve in his tanks was about to change the course of the Pacific War. By June of 1944, the Pacific theater had become a war of brutal geography, where the greatest enemy wasn't the Japanese Zero, but the sheer blue emptiness of the ocean. General George Kenney's 5th Air Force was facing a strategic paralysis that threatened to stall the advance toward the Philippines. The Lockheed P-380 Lightning, though a powerhouse with its twin Allison V-1710 engines, was a fuel-hungry monster governed by the rigid laws of thermodynamics. According to the official Allison technical manuals, the aircraft had a fixed combat radius of roughly 570 miles, a distance dictated by the requirement to maintain high RPM and an auto-rich fuel mixture to keep the cylinders from melting. This mathematical limit meant that vital Japanese staging areas, like those on the island of Biak or the Celebes, were effectively untouchable. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the elite Satan's Angels, watched helplessly as his pilots returned from long-range patrols on nothing but fumes. The statistics were harrowing. In May alone, the 5th Air Force lost 17 Lightnings not to enemy fire, but to dry tanks. Pilots were being forced to ditch their multi-million-dollar fighters within sight of their home runways simply because they lacked the 50 extra miles of range needed to clear the coastal reefs. The crisis reached a breaking point during a high-level briefing at Mockmerdrome, where Allison's field representatives and Air Force engineers stood firm on their metallurgical reality. They argued that any attempt to operate the engines below 2200 RPM while maintaining high manifold pressure, a condition known as oversquare, would lead to catastrophic detonation and engine seizure. To the engineers, the fuel consumption was a non-negotiable cost of doing business. The V-1710 was a high-performance racing engine adapted for war, and it demanded to be fed. MacDonald faced a grim choice: continue sending his men on missions where the margin for error was zero, or abandon the deep strike strategy entirely. The tension in the unit was palpable, a mixture of exhaustion and resentment toward the desk-bound experts who prioritized engine longevity over pilot survival. However, the unexpected twist came from the very heart of the establishment. Amid the heated arguments about gear ratios and cylinder head temperatures, a quiet, middle-aged man in civilian clothes began sketching a graph that contradicted 15 years of Allison's proprietary data. Charles Lindbergh wasn't looking at the manuals, he was looking at the pilots' faces, and he realized that the experts had spent so much time protecting the engines that they had forgotten how to fly the plane. On June 26, 1944, a tall, unassuming figure in a plain civilian flight suit stepped onto the sun-baked tarmac of Nadzab, New Guinea, carrying nothing but a small leather bag and an obsession with efficiency. Charles Augustus Lindbergh, the lone eagle who had conquered the Atlantic 17 years prior, was officially present as a technical representative for United Aircraft. At 42, he was a ghost from a different era of aviation, a man whose name was synonymous with the dawn of flight, but whose reputation had been tarnished with pre-war political controversies. To the young, battle-hardened pilots of Satan's Angels, Lindbergh was a living relic, a museum piece sent to observe their high-tech war from the sidelines. However, as Lindbergh sat in the sweltering operations tent, watching Colonel Charles MacDonald map out targets that remained tragically out of reach, his eyes weren't on the glory of the mission, but on the fuel logs. He listened to the complaints about the Allison V-1710's voracious appetite for high-octane gasoline, and he saw a mirror of the same impossible mathematics he had solved in 1927. While the military establishment viewed the P-38 as a delicate thoroughbred that had to be pushed to high RPMs to survive, Lindbergh saw a machine being strangled by its own safety protocols. The atmosphere in the briefing room shifted from polite deference to skepticism when Lindbergh finally spoke. He didn't offer platitudes, he offered a challenge to the very foundation of their training. "You are running your engines too fast," he stated calmly, his voice cutting through the humid air. He explained that by maintaining 2200 to 2400 RPM, the pilots were creating internal friction and heat that wasted precious fuel. He proposed a radical departure from the Allison manuals, dropping the engine speed to a staggering 1600 RPM while pushing the manifold pressure higher than anyone dared, a technique that theoretically optimized the torque of the big V-12s. The reaction from the group's maintenance officers was one of immediate alarm. To them, Lindbergh was suggesting they drive a race car in fifth gear at 10 miles per hour, a recipe for engine knock and shattered pistons. MacDonald, initially wary of risking his precious aircraft on the theories of a civilian, found himself captivated by Lindbergh's quiet confidence. The twist came when Lindbergh revealed he hadn't just calculated these numbers on paper. He had already been secretly testing them on long-distance transit flights, and he claimed he could stretch their combat radius by nearly 200 miles. With his men dying for the sake of 50 miles, MacDonald realized he couldn't afford to ignore the man who had once crossed an ocean on a prayer and a slide rule. The over-square theory Lindbergh presented was not merely a suggestion. It was a total subversion of 1940s aeronautical science. To the Allison engineers stationed with the 475th, the term described a forbidden state where manifold pressure, measured in inches of mercury, exceeded the engine's revolutions per minute in hundreds. For example, running at 30 inches of pressure while the RPM was dropped to a mere 1,600. In the eyes of the military establishment, this was a recipe for detonation, the uncontrolled explosion of fuel inside the cylinders that could shatter a piston or throw a rod in seconds. The Allison V1710 was a high-strung, liquid-cooled engine designed to breathe at high speeds. The manuals explicitly warned that operating below 2,000 RPM at high power settings would cause hotspots and catastrophic mechanical failure. Lindbergh, however, argued that the rich fuel mixtures dictated by the Air Force were actually cooling the engines inefficiently by wasting unburned gasoline. He believed that by leaning the mixture and slowing the engine, he could transform the P-38 from a sprinting thoroughbred into a long-distance marathon runner, leveraging the engine's massive torque rather than its raw speed. The tension reached a boiling point in the humid darkness of the maintenance hangar. Master mechanics and tech reps from Lockheed and Allison surrounded Lindbergh, pointing at the scorched spark plugs of planes that had barely survived standard missions. They accused him of reckless civilian tinkering that would leave pilots stranded over the ocean with seized bearings. But Lindbergh remained unshakable. He explained the physics of internal cooling and thermal efficiency with a clarity that unsettled the academics. He wasn't just guessing, he was applying the same meticulous fuel-to-air ratio calculations that had allowed the Spirit of St. Louis to defy the Atlantic. He challenged the commanders to look at the auto-lean setting on their carburetors, a switch most pilots were ordered to never touch in flight. The unexpected twist? As the arguments grew more heated, Lindbergh produced a set of flight logs from his own transit flights. While the squadron's average fuel burn was 60 to 70 gallons per hour per engine, Lindbergh's logs showed a steady, impossible 45. He hadn't just discovered a theory, he had already committed technical treason against the Air Force manuals, and his engines hadn't just survived, they were running cleaner than the planes on the front line. On June 30th, 1944, Charles Lindbergh climbed into the cockpit of P-38J Lightning, serial number 4423314, a battle-hardened aircraft belonging to Colonel MacDonald's personal flight. The air at Mockmerdrome was thick with heat and anticipation, as a crowd of skeptical mechanics and anxious officers gathered to witness what many believed would be a terminal engine failure. Lindbergh's pre-flight routine was a masterclass in precision. He didn't just check the surfaces, he listened to the vibration of the airframe as the twin Allison engines coughed to life. As he taxied toward the runway, he did the unthinkable. He pulled the propeller governors back until the needles dropped to 1,600 RPM. The ground crew watched in stunned silence. At that speed, the engines sounded sluggish, lacking the aggressive roar that usually signaled a safe takeoff. Lindbergh advanced the throttles, pushing the manifold pressure up to 30 inches, explicitly violating the over-square prohibition. He then reached for the mixture control and clicked it into auto-lean. According to every training manual in the U.S. Army Air Forces, the engines should have begun knocking immediately, their internal temperatures spiking until the pistons fused with the cylinder walls. Instead of a catastrophic explosion, the Lightning lifted off smoothly, climbing into the tropical sky with a hauntingly quiet hum. For 4 hours, Lindbergh pushed the aircraft through a grueling series of test patterns, his eyes locked onto the cylinder head temperature gauges. He was flying a suicide profile, daring the metallurgy of the Allison V-1710 to fail. But the expected disaster never came. As he monitored the kneeboard where he meticulously logged every parameter, he realized the thermal efficiency was actually increasing. The engines were running cooler than they did under safe, standard procedures. When he finally brought the silver fighter back to the tarmac, the fuel gauges told a story that left the maintenance officers speechless. Under standard cruise settings, the flight should have consumed over 230 gallons. Lindbergh had used only 175. The 25% reduction in fuel burn was no longer a theory, it was a verified reality. The unexpected twist came during the post-flight inspection. Expecting to find scorched valves and metal shavings in the oil filters, the head mechanic instead found that the spark plugs were cleaner than they had been before takeoff. Lindbergh hadn't just saved fuel, he had discovered that the prohibited settings were actually the healthiest way to fly the plane. The success of the Lindbergh method on the flight line didn't bring immediate celebration. Instead, it ignited a firestorm of bureaucratic fury. On July 2, 1944, a high-level delegation of engineering officers from 5th Air Force Headquarters, led by Colonel Earl Barnes and accompanied by Allison's chief field representative, Robert Patterson, arrived at Drome. They didn't come to congratulate the 475th, they came to shut them down. In a sweltering, smoke-filled briefing room, Patterson unleashed a barrage of technical data, arguing that what Lindbergh was doing was metallurgical heresy. He insisted that the Allison V-1710 was a precision-engineered machine whose operating limits were forged in thousands of hours of laboratory testing. To Patterson, Lindbergh was a dangerous amateur playing Russian roulette with government property. Colonel MacDonald, standing firm beside the civilian aviator, presented the flight logs from 16 successful missions that proved the engines were running cooler and more efficiently than ever. The room became a battlefield of theory versus practice, with the Allison reps claiming that physics itself prohibited these settings, while Lindbergh calmly countered that their manuals were based on the wrong assumptions about thermal load and cruise efficiency. The deadlock was broken when General Ennis Whitehead, the deputy commander of the 5th Air Force, stepped into the fray. A man of cold, hard results, Whitehead wasn't interested in theoretical debates. He was interested in the mounting casualty body of pilots lost to fuel exhaustion. He silenced the room by pulling out a folder containing the casualty reports from the previous 6 weeks. 23 pilots who had followed Allison's procedures to the letter and died because their tanks ran dry 50 miles short of safety. Whitehead looked at the Allison representatives and asked a single, devastating question. What is the worst-case scenario if we adopt this fleet-wide? Patterson predicted widespread engine failure, but Lindbergh interjected, pointing out that if an engine showed any sign of distress, a pilot could simply revert to standard settings in seconds. The technique failed safely, but the current procedures failed fatally. The unexpected twist came when Whitehead didn't just authorize the technique for MacDonald's group, he ordered it documented and distributed to every P-38 squadron in the Pacific. He overruled the manufacturers and the safety boards, essentially betting the air war on the instincts of a civilian over the blueprints of the engineers. Lindbergh had won the political war, but the ultimate validation would only come from the heat of real combat. The Lindbergh Way faced its ultimate trial on July 28, 1944, during an armed reconnaissance mission over Sarum Island that pushed the squadron 640 miles from their base at Drome. In the old days, such a distance would have left the pilots with barely enough fuel to cross the target, let alone survive a dogfight. But as the 20 P-38 Lightnings of the 475th Fighter Group droned through the humid air, they were operating at the forbidden settings, 1,600 RPM and 30 inches of manifold pressure. Colonel MacDonald and Charles Lindbergh, flying as a lead pair, watched their gauges with a quiet intensity. The engines hummed with a low, rhythmic throb that felt alien to pilots accustomed to the high-pitched scream of 2,400 RPM. At 0947 hours, the formation spotted a lone Mitsubishi K-51 Sonya bomber escorted by a swarm of A-6M Zeros. In any previous engagement, the Americans would have had to calculate every second of throttle usage, fearing that a high-speed chase would leave them to ditch in the shark-infested waters below. Today, however, they possessed a hidden reserve of energy that the Japanese intelligence officers hadn't accounted for. MacDonald gave the order to tally-ho, and the Lightnings rolled into a vertical dive, their heavy airframes accelerating toward the sea-level combat zone with a predatory speed that shattered the enemy's formation. The engagement at low altitude was where the P-38 traditionally lost its edge to the agile Japanese fighters, but the fuel savings from the transit had granted the Americans a tactical luxury: the ability to engage in sustained war emergency power. Lindbergh, closing on the Sonya, shoved his throttles forward, feeling the surge of the twin turbo-superchargers as the manifold pressure spiked to 46 inches. Captain Saburo Shimada, the Japanese pilot, attempted a desperate defensive turn, assuming the heavy American fighter would wallow and stall in the thick tropical air. Instead, the P-38 responded with terrifying precision. Lindbergh's 4.5 caliber machine guns and his 20mm cannon converged on the Sonya, disintegrating the bomber in a hail of lead. As the remaining Zeros attempted to intervene, they were shocked to find the Americans fighting with an aggressiveness that ignored the distance from home. The unexpected twist came when the dogfight ended. As the squadron reformed to head back across 600 miles of hostile ocean, MacDonald called for a fuel check. The pilots reported reserves that were almost double what the standard manuals predicted. The illegal technique hadn't just gotten them to the fight, it had given them the dominance to finish it and the safety to return, proving that Lindbergh's civilian tinkering was the most effective weapon in the 5th Air Force arsenal. By September 1945, the Lindbergh Way had transitioned from a desperate frontline experiment into the gold standard of the United States Army Air Forces. The statistical impact of the civilians' intervention was staggering. Fuel exhaustion losses across the P-38 fleet dropped by nearly 70%, and an estimated 234 pilots survived the war who otherwise would have vanished into the Pacific. The Allison Engine Company, which had once threatened to ground any pilot following Lindbergh's lead, performed a silent corporate retreat. In October 1944, they revised their official technical manuals, surreptitiously replacing the prohibited range with the exact settings Lindbergh had pioneered: 1,600 RPM and 30 inches of manifold pressure, now labeling it as the recommended cruise setting. There was no public apology to the 475th Fighter Group, and no mention of the 42-year-old observer who had proven their engineering department wrong. Yet the validation came in the form of a private letter from Robert Patterson, the very field representative who had fought Lindbergh in the Mockmerdrome briefing room. He admitted that their testing protocols had been incomplete and that the V-1710 was a better, more durable engine because one man had the courage to question the metallurgical status quo. The war ended, and the Lone Eagle returned to the shadows of private life, true to his modest and complex nature. Despite having directly contributed to nearly 1,500 additional enemy aircraft destroyed, targets reached only because of the extended combat radius, Lindbergh refused any official commendations or medals for his technical breakthrough. He even requested that General George Kenney minimize his name in the official memoirs of the 5th Air Force, insisting that the credit belonged to the young men like Colonel MacDonald who risked their lives to trust a civilian's math. In 1954, President Eisenhower restored Lindbergh's commission and promoted him to brigadier general, a quiet nod to his wartime service. The true legacy of his forbidden physics lives on not in trophies, but in every modern aircraft that utilizes lean-of-peak operations and high-torque, low-RPM cruise profiles. Lindbergh proved that the ultimate survival tool in warfare isn't just the machine or the manual, but the intellectual defiance to ask, what if the experts are wrong? The pilots of Satan's angels who returned home with fuel to spare didn't need a medal to know that their lives were the final undeniable proof of the Lone Eagle's victory.